Franklin D. Roosevelt once said, "In the truest sense, freedom cannot be bestowed, it must be achieved." This seemingly simple statement holds profound philosophical, moral, and political depth. It reflects not only the American spirit, but also the essence of human existence throughout all ages. When Roosevelt spoke of freedom, he did not mean a right enshrined in constitutions, nor the flags waving over public squares, nor the grand speeches of lawmakers. He was speaking of an existential power, an inner state of being, a quality of the soul, something that can only be born out of action, willpower, and the yearning of a human being to affirm themselves. The historical context of Roosevelt's words was a world in turmoil. His America had just emerged from the Great Depression of 1929. Millions were unemployed, disillusioned, and devoid of hope. Across Europe, totalitarian regimes were rising, promising people order and stability in exchange for their freedom. It was in this moment that Roosevelt voiced a simple yet devastating truth. Freedom is never a gift. A nation or an individual who believes freedom can be handed to them has already accepted a subtle form of slavery. The slavery of passivity, of dependence on external authority, of abandoning one's own selfhood. Freedom, he said, truly exists only when it is seized by one's own effort. It is the result of action, not the reward of fortune. On a philosophical level, Roosevelt's statement stands at the crossroads of existentialism, liberal philosophy, and Enlightenment thought. It expresses faith in the human being as a self-determining creature, what Immanuel Kant called moral autonomy. According to Kant, a person is free only when acting according to reason and conscience, not under the sway of desires, fears, or external commands. Roosevelt, though not a philosopher by profession, shared that same intuition. Freedom is not doing whatever one wants, but living in accordance with reason and dignity. A person may live in a democracy, have the right to vote and to speak, yet if they live in fear or depend on others to make choices for them, they have never truly known freedom. The phrase, "in the truest sense," is crucial. It signals a distinction between the superficial and the essential. Roosevelt did not deny that there are forms of freedom bestowed by laws, constitutions, or governments, but he made a sharp distinction between the form and the substance of liberty. The form is the legal right, the substance is the will, and the act of living up to that right. Many people think they have freedom simply because they live in a democracy, yet they exist in a quiet form of servitude, the servitude of complacency, comfort, and the fear of being different. Roosevelt saw this danger within American society itself. People waiting for the state to rescue them, expecting salvation from power, rather than standing up to create their own destiny. At that point, he said, freedom is lost. Freedom cannot be bestowed, for if someone has the power to grant you freedom, that same person has the power to take it away. Every granted freedom carries an implicit condition. Every given liberty hides the seed of control. True freedom cannot reside in the hands of rulers, be they kings, presidents, or elected governments. It lies in the actions of each individual, in the capacity to choose, the courage to take responsibility, and the awareness that no one else can live my life for me. This is what made Roosevelt exceptional. He did not speak to his citizens as a benefactor, bestowing privileges, but as a voice awakening them from dependency. He said, in essence, take your own freedom, because no one else can live in your place. Yet, to achieve is not synonymous with to seize by force. The verb achieve in Roosevelt's statement means to attain through effort, through discipline, through the moral labor of being human. Freedom, in his understanding, is the outcome of education, work, courage, and self-mastery. A society is truly free only when its citizens think independently, work diligently, and assume responsibility for themselves. An individual is truly free only when they are not enslaved by their desires, by public opinion, by fear, or by their own past. Freedom does not mean the absence of all constraints. It means mastering them. This thought continues the American philosophical tradition that began with the nation's founding. Thomas Jefferson declared that freedom is the inalienable right of every person. But Roosevelt added a deeper, existential layer. That right means nothing unless you live up to it. If Jefferson affirmed the right to be free, Roosevelt demanded the responsibility to live freely. He understood that a right without the capacity to exercise it is an empty form. This is why his New Deal was more than an economic program. It was a redefinition of the relationship between government and citizen. The state provides opportunities, but the people must seize them. Freedom cannot exist in passivity. What makes this even more powerful is that Roosevelt himself was paralyzed. He could not walk and spent most of his presidency in a wheelchair. Yet it was through that very limitation that he became a symbol of resilience, a living testament that while the body can be confined, the human will cannot. When he said freedom must be achieved, it was not a theoretical statement. It was his lived experience. One is free only when one refuses to surrender to fate. From a philosophical standpoint, Roosevelt emphasized a truth shared by all great moral traditions. Freedom is internal. No one can give you freedom if you do not believe you deserve it. Buddhism teaches that freedom comes from letting go. Christianity teaches that truth shall make you free. Roosevelt, in secular modern terms, said that freedom must be achieved. 3 different languages, one essence. Freedom is an inner journey, an awakening of the self to its own dignity. His words also carry a deep political warning. When people rely on power to grant freedom, they surrender to that power the right to own their souls. Tyrannies endure not because they are strong, but because people are weak in their belief that someone else must save them. That freedom is something to be restored by others. Roosevelt knew that democracy cannot survive if its citizens lack the spirit of freedom. A government may hold elections, but if its people do not think independently or judge for themselves, those elections are but hollow rituals. Freedom cannot be created by structure. It must be born from the soul. Seen through the existential lens, Roosevelt's words reveal a profound modern tragedy. Freedom is both a longing and a burden. To be free is to bear responsibility for one's choices. Out of fear of that responsibility, many seek refuge in authority, in conformity, in habit, in media, in blind faith. They trade freedom for safety. Roosevelt sought to break that chain. He taught that happiness does not come from being protected, but from being tested. Freedom is not the avoidance of risk. It is the courage to face risk with dignity. In a broader sense, Roosevelt was reflecting on the relationship between freedom and value. A human being has worth only when living as if freedom must constantly be regained, every day, every hour, against the paralysis of the spirit. When you work because you choose to, not because you must. When you speak what you believe, even if it is unpopular. When you refuse to sell your conscience for comfort, then you are achieving freedom. Freedom is not distant. It is the quiet act of resisting conformity, of staying true to oneself amid the noise of the world. Roosevelt grasped this deeply, and so his words transcend politics to become a philosophy of life. Freedom, when examined closely, is not only a right, but also a duty. To be free is to be obliged to protect the freedom of others. Roosevelt did not speak of selfish liberty, the kind that exists for personal gratification, but of freedom as the foundation of community. A society endures only when its members see the defense of others' liberty as their own moral task. If I wish to speak, I must allow others to speak, even when I disagree. freedom cannot survive if it is reserved for a few. Thus, when Roosevelt said it must be achieved, he meant not only for oneself, but for all. Today, his words ring with renewed urgency. Humanity lives among countless virtual freedoms: the freedom to click, to post, to buy, to choose products. Yet behind these freedoms lie invisible systems that manipulate and shape our thinking. When social media gives us the illusion of speaking, yet makes us dependent on others' approval, that is not freedom, but its simulation. Roosevelt, if alive today, might have said, "Technological liberty cannot replace spiritual liberty." True freedom exists only when one dares to think independently and does not require permission to be authentic. Freedom ultimately is an endless journey. No one wins it once and for all. Every generation must reclaim it in its own way against new forms of servitude, indifference, intellectual laziness, manipulation, and the erosion of trust. Roosevelt understood that freedom is something to be achieved, a process of constant effort and renewal. It is not a possession, but a way of living. When humanity ceases to fight for freedom, freedom begins to die, not because someone took it, but because we cease to believe it was worth the struggle. With a single sentence, Roosevelt captured the soul of modern humanity. We are born not to be granted, but to create our own lives. Freedom lies not in the hands of others, but in our awakening to our own condition. Fragile, finite, yet capable of saying, "I am." In that very moment, when we choose to act, to be honest, to stand unbowed, we have attained freedom in the truest sense that Roosevelt spoke of. Therefore, in the truest sense, freedom cannot be bestowed, it must be achieved, is not the statement of a politician, but the declaration of a soul that has understood. Freedom is the highest dignity of man and the greatest test of spiritual maturity. It reminds us that no one, no government, no religion, no society can give us freedom if we do not dare to live worthy of it, and that freedom is never finished. It is a flame that must be kept alive each day through courage, awareness, and an unyielding love for truth and for humankind.